This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me for the Thursday edition here of Point of View. Next hour, we're going to get into all sorts of issues in the news. Of course, we had riots in Louisville, Kentucky, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Breonna Taylor. We'll talk about media coverage in that regard. We've posted some very good material. One by Heather McDonald's been on the program, Blue Truth Matters. One by John Cass about the Ginsburg death and the impact that this could have on the election in terms of replacing a Supreme Court nominee. We'll look at a number of other aspects of the election, but we want to postpone some of that for the next hour. And just in order for you to kind of know what's coming up, we will be getting into some of those stories in the next hour. But then after that, Ilya Shapiro will be with us. His new book out, Supreme Disorder, all about judicial nominations. I thought that would be appropriate. And then we'll finish the program today with Dennis Prager, who's been in the studio with us before. This will be by phone, and we'll talk about his film No Safe Spaces, as well as all sorts of commentaries we've quoted from him recently. So it's going to be a great couple of hours. But in studio with me today is a good friend and an individual I work with day to day, Paul Rutherford, who is with Probe Ministries. He's a researcher, writer, and speaker for Probe, individual that graduated from Rice University with degrees in philosophy and religious studies, an individual that really has been working in this area of philosophy of religion, world religions, faith, and culture, has lectured in churches and schools in Texas, Asia, Europe, all over the place. But most importantly, in just a few minutes, we're going to talk about this new podcast. It's called Head and Heart. It's a Probe podcast that you might want to know more about. If you click on the button there that we have at pointofview.net that says see more, just simply scroll down to his picture and it will immediately take you to the first 6 episodes that exist with the Head and Heart podcast. But first of all, Paul, thank you for joining us in studio today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kerby. That was a very warm welcome and a great intro. I appreciate the warm welcome there. I'm glad to be here and excited to share with you about the Head and Heart podcast. It's a really exciting, new, and wonderful resource from Probe, and Probe has been producing tremendous stuff for decades. And so it's an organization I respect, and I'm very glad I get to be a part of it and get to work with you so closely and so often, Kerby. So it's a lot of fun, and I'm looking forward to sharing with our listeners about the podcast.
One of the things I got from one of our listeners who already has listened to the podcast is, Kerby, I'm so used to you being the person asking the questions and being the host. And actually, Kerby, you did pretty well when actually Paul was interviewing you and asking you the questions. So we'll get into that in just a minute. I know most of our listeners are familiar with Probe Ministries. Certainly that is a place where I start my day so often. But for just a few minutes, let's talk about that, because it also kind of relates to how we ended up with this podcast. Of course, Probe Radio has been out there for decades and producing material that's a podcast, but this is the typical podcast where you have usually 2 people sitting around a table talking about some of those issues. But talk about Probe Ministries.
Yeah, you got it. You got it. This is a podcast that, as I like to say, was given birth as a podcast, as opposed to radio, which is great, but we also stream it through podcast mediums. But so to understand the podcast is to understand something about Probe, which is to equip Christians to think biblically the other 6 days of the week, sometimes I say on the podcast, or as Probe would say, the vision is to free believers from cultural captivity and to build them into confident ambassadors for Christ. Colossians 2:8 says, see to it that no one takes you captive through philosophy and empty deception according to the elementary principles of the world and the traditions of men rather than according to Christ. And that's Paul's admonition to the church in Colossae, that they wouldn't be thinking either according to Jewish tradition necessarily or according to Greek philosophy, regardless of what the thoughts of man are. The truth is that Scripture is true and God is true and the mind of God has truth. And he's revealed it to us, and it's important that as believers we're transformed by the renewing of our mind, kind of a Romans 12:1. These are some of the founding verses of Probe Ministries, and this is really the intent or the heart behind the podcast, if I can make a pun there. It's to equip Christians to think biblically effectively, and I know from my own experience, a lot of it comes from what feels like to me when I'm being freed myself from cultural captivity. It feels like unlearning. It's like, this thing that I learned or this thing that I thought was true, I suddenly I move first into a phase of doubt, like, is that really true? And then I as I reflect on it, as I read God's word, as he moves through his people and through his spirit, I realize, maybe some of those things really weren't true. I'm getting that from culture. I'm getting that from TV or from movies or from books or from my parents or from my friends, or I'm just making it up on my own because I think I'm so smart in myself when I'm really not. But these are some of the ways that the Lord is moving and making life change through Probe Ministries, and so that's really the intent of the ministry itself, which of course you know so much about. But also that's part of what we're trying to do with the podcast, is to try to create another resource, create offering the fantastic resources that Probe has to offer in a format and into an audience that is already a part of the Probe family, so to speak, but giving it to them in a way that is, as we've already talked about, birthed out of being a podcast as opposed to being repurposed from radio, which is great. That's different.
And really, it's a different medium. We're starting the day with Paul Rutherford, ending the day with Dennis Prager, and I'll use Dennis Prager as an illustration because if you watch the Prager U videos, you are recognizing that most all of that is scripted off. Matter of fact, oftentimes I even notice that they seem to be reading off a teleprompter, and so you probably could even get a script from it. But then there are times when Dennis Prager gets in front of his fireplace and he has his bulldog Otto next to him, and this is completely unscripted and kind of conversational. And there is a sense in which if you watch or have listened to for these many years the Probe radio program, which is on hundreds and hundreds of radio stations, we do have a transcript and people can find that on the website, probe.org. But then this podcast is a little more conversational. And I think you would probably agree, Paul, that some of our scholars are pretty academic types.
Indeed.
And we have many times tried to make sure that they still recognize that on the Probe radio program, they have to communicate to the average listener. And I think they've done a pretty good job. But the podcast even is one step lower. It's just like two people sitting over a cup of coffee having a conversation.
You know, you nailed it there. I think that description is great. It's fantastic. I mean, that's what we're going for.
Yeah.
And it makes it that much more accessible. Like you're saying, it's a great way to translate the great ideas and the great resources that a lot of our colleagues at Probe have, because they're so well trained and so well experienced. It takes a lot of those really high ideas from academia and makes them much more accessible in a format that's conversational. I mean, conversation is as old as life itself. We're
going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about some of the various episodes, one dealing with the subject of archaeology, one dealing with the issue of gender. Oh, many times have we had conversations about that. Then evidence for Jesus from non-Christian sources. We did two of those simply because that is one of the hot button issues. You know, if I don't believe the Bible, do we even have any evidence apart from the Bible that Jesus exists? Well, yes. One on tactics, and then one on climate change. Those are just the first six. Of course, you might give us a preview of some others we'll be talking about in just a minute. But if you find yourself saying, I'd kind of like to know about this podcast, we've made it very easy for you, because as you go to the website, either you can go directly to probe.org, look on the left-hand side, and you'll see the one that says Head and Heart. Or on our website, pointofview.net, just click on the button where you can see Paul Rutherford, and it will take you there. Now, we will come back and talk about how you can subscribe, but even if you aren't on Apple, Google, Amazon Music, Stitcher, you probably don't even know what some of those things are, you can still download any one of those podcasts as well. So we've made it really easy, but we need to take a break. We'll continue our conversation about Head and Heart right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a previous set of commentaries, I talked about the interview that we did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Then I saw an essay that quoted his earlier book, The Righteous Mind, where he talked about the conservative advantage. As a liberal, he wrote the book because he was convinced that American liberals did not get the morals and motives of their conservative countrymen. In one study he did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick, they tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. They had people fill out their moral foundations questionnaire. 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questions normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. The design of the research allowed the researchers to examine the stereotypes that each side had about the other. This also allowed them to see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and people who were conservative. They concluded that the results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. I might add that this study was published 10 years ago. I think that it's even more likely that the gap in perception by liberals of conservatives has grown even more. Much of what Jonathan Haidt has written about in his recent books illustrates how millennial college students want even more protection from ideas they don't like. They're less likely than before to engage foreign ideas. And this is one example of why we have such polarization in the political arena. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
In studio with me today, Paul Rutherford, who is with Probe Ministries, a staff member, and also really the host of Head and Heart podcast, which we will get to in just a minute. But I thought, since you are sort of in that age range of the millennial generation, not everybody that joins our millennial roundtable, sometimes they even let somebody like me on, are necessarily millennials. But this Monday, we had, of course, the millennial roundtable, which we have on a pretty regular basis. And I thought it would be worth for just a minute, Paul, talking about the fact that Probe Ministries has done really one of the most extensive surveys ever done of the millennial generation. And very soon, working with Steve Cable, who's been on the program with us as well, we have a survey ready to go out and then eventually publicized, most likely more next year, about looking not only at the Generation Y millennial generation, but the Generation Z iGen generation. But if people find themselves saying, I'm still trying to figure out what's going on with the millennial generation, there's a lot of great material at Probe Ministries, isn't there?
Yeah, there really is, and some of the interesting findings from the survey of millennials was really inquiring into what they believe about what we call a Christian worldview around Probe. The sad finding overall, I will say, is not encouraging, but let me lay it on you. If we ask a basic set of 6 biblical worldview questions and we say, hey, how many what percent of these millennials, at the time they were about 20, several years ago, what percent of them believe in all 6 of just really basic biblical worldview? And the sad part is just above a quarter. It's between a quarter and a third, 27%. Wow. Yeah, it was sobering. I remember when the survey was revealed and we found out the results. It was really so eye-opening. Okay, but some of the questions, I can share those with you. Some of the questions were: is God all-powerful? Is he an all-powerful creator? And 92% agreed with that, which sounds great. And so, to clarify further, it's not just millennials, but also millennial evangelicals.
Yes.
And that's not just self-identifying Christians. It's people who do self-identify. Yes, I'm a Christian, but also when you say, "What do you mean by that?" they say something like, "I have a relationship with Jesus Christ that is personal and meaningful to me today, and that relationship is the basis for my salvation." So those two indicators, which is a great
pretty close,
way above a self-identified Christian, whatever that means to you. So just keeping that in mind, we're talking about that subset of Americans, and then millennials in particular, 20-year-olds at the time. And so the vast majority agree that God's all-powerful, which is great, and that makes sense. If you ask a different question, did Jesus live a sinless life? Interesting result. 66% agreed. Only 66%
So
agreed.
1/3 said, no.
Right. A full 1/3 said no. They probably would have agreed with someone recently, their sentiment in the news, that Jesus, he was just, he was a messed up guy like me. He had his own faults, not a perfect person. Okay. That's not what the scriptures reveal in the New Testament at all. 3 or 4 others. Do absolute morals exist? 65% said agreed. Okay, well, it's almost half, about 2/3 there, right? Is the Bible 100% accurate in what it teaches? 61%. Again, we're in that kind of 2/3 range.
It's dropping off.
So if we're giving ourselves grades, what are these? Not good. C, D level. It's been a while since I've been in school. Another survey question: is Satan real? 48% agreed Satan's real. So that's about half, only half and half. And then, do you get to heaven based on your faith and not by works? Only 52% agreed with that. So if you take each of those, they're in between between half and 92%. So any one of those indicators, you might say, okay, we're not batting 1,000 here, but it's okay. It's not, let's raise the arms, let's scream, let's say the sky is falling. But the more interesting question, one of the key insights of Steve Cable that you've had on the show before, is really asking the question that I think a minister would ask, which is, I'm not so interested in what you think about any one of these particular indicators. I'm much more interested in you, as a disciple of Jesus, having a holistic biblical worldview. Do you believe in all of these? Mm-hmm. Right? I mean, I think any pastor who's listening is going to say, yeah, I want you to believe in all of these. Any minister, any missionary is going to say, yeah, I want you to hold to all 6 of these. And so that's where that key finding is that I started with, that what percentage of those 20-year-old millennials back, I think it was 10 years ago, 2010 when the survey was issued, believed in all 6, and it was only 27%. Yes. And so Kerby, that's just reality. I think it's sad, but that's reality. And so as a missionary, as a writer, as one who's called to fulfill the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's one of the motivators behind this new podcast, Head and Heart, is that there are so many believers who have a relationship with Jesus, but they're not discipled.
And the other part of this, which I'll just mention real quickly, is if they don't have a biblical worldview. In other words, if they're not thinking Christianly, then they're not acting Christianly as well. And so if people want to see more of the survey, they can see that if you don't think from a biblical point of view, you probably don't, in many cases, act from a biblical worldview. And that gets worse and worse as you begin to ask more and more questions about how that affects, just for example, things like, do you pray? Do you read the Bible? And then what do you think about issues ranging from some of the things we're going to talk about now in the podcast, from sex, abortion, variety of those kinds of things. And so before we move on, let me also mention that as people go to the website, probe.org, and check that survey out, some of the listeners out there might say, wait a minute, I'm a pastor, I'm a Sunday school teacher, I'm a small group leader. Do you have any solutions? And, of course, there's a program called Periscope, which is actually a 7-week series that actually can be used in your church, in your small group, in your Bible study. It already has videos that you can use. It has great material. It has a book that has 49 chapters, so you read 1 chapter a day. And this has been an opportunity for individuals who obviously don't have a biblical worldview to kind of have an aha moment and say, wait a minute, I really need to actually apply biblical principles, and that has been something we've been making available for years. So, again, that's on the website, probe.org, right? Indeed
it is. It's on the website, and the new podcast, Head and Heart, is also on the website. You can, if you don't podcast, if that's weird to you, if that's new to you, you can download it as its own file. You can stream it through our website as well. If you do podcast, you can access it through whatever platform you're using to get it. It's currently on Apple, Google, Amazon Music, and Stitcher, if you're using those directly as well. But I wanted to say one more motivating thing about the podcast, which is that in a world today where there's hundreds of thousands of different podcasts, and many of them are great, and I'm a podcaster myself, consumer, I love to listen to them and learn just a lot about all kinds of niche things. This one is, and even within one more qualifier, even within the space of equipping and discipleship and Christian spirituality, which itself these days is its own massive industry, ever growing massive industry, and it should be. It's great. There's a ton of people out there doing a ton of great work, but even within equipping, this one our attempt at Probe, my particular intent at Probe, is to position this one as somewhat different, at least for us, that this is not just about information. We're not strictly trying to give you, hey, here's the doctrine. We're really aiming at the heart, and that's why the podcast was named Head and Heart. It's really Romans 12:1. It's you being transformed by your mind being renewed, just like you were talking about a second ago, how the findings from our survey at Probe have, when we ask what do you believe, those are entirely inform what it is that you do. Beliefs inform your behavior. In fact, they're necessary, I would say. They're necessary and sufficient. If you don't believe biblically, there's no way in which someone who calls himself a Christian can behave Christianly. So this podcast is in many ways an effort to stem that and to address that issue. I also think about just the wisdom of Proverbs. Proverbs 22:7 says, "Listen to the words of the wise, apply your heart to my instruction, for it is good to keep these sayings in your heart, and always ready on your lips. I'm teaching you today, yes, you, so that you will trust in the Lord." And I love how Proverbs encapsulates the wisdom there of what we're trying to do on the podcast, is to teach you so that you will trust in the Lord.
Let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll get into some of the things that are on the podcast, and again, trying to answer some of the questions that people run into. We'll first focus on the subject of archaeology. Some people say, do we really have any evidence that the Bible is true? We'll look at ancient evidence for Jesus. Do we have any evidence that Jesus existed apart from the Bible? And then, of course, some of the issues we talk about here. What about this idea of gender and sexual orientation, and how do we address that issue? And if we have an individual or friend that maybe is expressing these kinds of views, is there a way we can respond to it? The one with Greg Kogel's book, Tactics, we've had him on the program before, which is really helpful in terms of doing evangelism and apologetics. And then if we have time, we'll get into the one by Dr. Ray Boland on climate change. And I know you've got a couple of others coming up, so we'll wait till after the break to get into some of those and to announce some of those that will be in the future. And as he pointed out, if you go to the website, probe.org, you can certainly find that. By the way, we also have a Spanish website that's linked there that you can find. And so those of you that are very familiar with how to do a podcast, you can go to Apple or Google or Amazon Music or Stitcher. And those are indeed platforms, if you're not familiar with those. And you can then subscribe so that it shows up on a regular basis. But even if you are not on any of those platforms, there is a way that you can download any of those into an MP3 file and have a chance to listen to that when you're walking or jogging or biking or just in your car. So those are resources we're making available today. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Paul Rutherford in studio with us today of Probe Ministries, also, of course, the host of this podcast, Head and Heart. And I think you would like to know more about that. And if you are interested, you can go to probe.org and find it. Or, of course, on our website, pointofview.net, we have a link directly to the podcast. And as you go there, you'll see that there are already 6 episodes and more to come. So we'll talk about those in just a minute. And if you'd like to join us, maybe you've already listened to the podcast or have some questions about it, 1-800-351-1212. Or else feel free just to sit back and listen. And Paul, the first one is actually an interview you did with me on archaeology.
That's right.
And it's called The Value of Archaeology, New Findings and Contributions from New Technology. And I did it for a couple of reasons. And one was you run into people all the time saying, the Bible's just full of errors. It makes all sorts of historical errors. And archaeology has disproved the Bible. And I go, no, it has not. Actually, the archaeology that we have today is much better than it was a century ago. So I spent some time talking about all the new findings. We also, as you mentioned in the title, have some contributions with new technology. And the point is that about a year ago, Christianity Today had this really good article about all the most significant finds just in 1 year.
Yep.
Now, what was so intriguing is that some of those were not just findings in that year. Some of those were found before, but new technology allowed us, for example, to read this ring. It was, if you will, the ring that had Pontius Pilate on it, and the technology allowed us to read that. We've developed all sorts of new technologies to begin to understand a lot more. But the point is, why did we do one on archaeology? Because that sounds like kind of a less interesting topic, unless you're thinking about Indiana Jones. He made that kind of interesting. It's really one of the big questions that people run into all the time. And if you're sitting across the table or chatting with somebody or on Facebook and they're just giving you, well, archaeology has disproved the Bible, history has disproved the Bible, you can say, wait a minute, there's a podcast I really like you to listen to because it gives you some of the ammunition that you would need to try to answer that question.
Yeah, that's right. And the really interesting thing, maybe I'm a total nerd, but I love the archaeological findings that are coming up all the time and that are newsworthy, and wonderful sources like Christianity Today can cull them and give us the top 10 from the year, and those are all really interesting, and they're really wonderful because I guess as an apologist, as a professional apologist, I'm interacting with two different kinds of people. The people who don't believe, and they're, as you say, they're marshaling these criticisms. Oh, history's disproved the Bible, and well, actually, it's not only not, we're finding things all the time. In fact, it's a testament to how significant the volume of evidence is archaeologically that's consistent with what's revealed in the Word, that it doesn't make the news anymore. Yeah. It's just not newsy because there's another one, throw it in the pile. Oh, there's another one. But we do talk through a few of those. We cherry picked some really good ones. You did, in fact, on your episode, and that one was really interesting and really good because it does that one thing for those who don't believe, but the second interesting thing that it does in conversations for someone like me who's an apologist is that it also bolsters the faith of those who do believe. For those who believe and go to church and they say, man, I believe in Jesus Christ, sometimes I have doubts. Sometimes I'm really not sure. There's a lot of haters out there. There's a lot of skeptics. There's a lot of really smart people who don't believe in this stuff. And what am I supposed to do with that? And the really cool thing is this podcast will help you address some of those questions you ask in the dark parts of your mind. And we open them up. We shine light on them. We talk about it. We invite questions, and we explore it. What do the issues say? What are findings saying? What is archaeology finding today in recent digs? And we talk through it. It's really interesting. And like you pointed out, there's a really fun distinction in what's being found, not only in what's being literally unearthed from the dig, but also in the technology, because technology is changing. It's allowing us to access things that we already have and see things that we haven't seen before. I know in one of those segments you talked about some, I might mess up the details here, but there's some ancient scroll that was so fragile it couldn't be unrolled, which I'm sure is not uncommon in that field. But because of recent imaging techniques. There's now this new technique that can read what's written on the scroll without opening it up.
Yes.
Which is just absolutely amazing.
Amazing they can do that. Having put myself through graduate school programming computers, I know how complex that program is, and then also how very significant the technology is. But let me keep moving, because then one of the others is called Gender Spectra, and it's by Sue Bolam. She's been on the program with us before. And Paul, there's a good example of we don't know what to say. We run into somebody that is concerned about sexual orientation. They're concerned about maybe whether or not their son or daughter is manifesting some characteristics that don't seem right, or they're wondering about transgenderism and all the rest. And Sue Bolam, because she has worked so often in this field and for so long, just gives a very good, accurate assessment with a great deal of love, and recognizing that some people are still going to reject the message, but at least it helps you, if you will, communicate both the truth in love in a way that is going to be heard by at least most people if they're honest seekers. And so I think that was a very good piece there as well.
Yeah, it's a really great one. The gender spectrum is something that has changed the way I view gender, and especially as a dad. My kids are 8, 6, and 3. They're little. I was at the park the other day. My wife had gone off to do something. I gave her the morning off, and I was with the kids, and we were playing on the swings, and just greeted one of our neighbors and chatted and started engaging in a conversation. And we're talking about connecting on parenting of little kids. And she had 2 little boys also, about my boy's age. And she began to talk about how one boy was really into cars and trucks and basketballs, but the other boy wasn't really into. He wanted it. He was quiet and he sat by himself. And she began to wonder. She asked, how can these 2 boys be so different? And I said, well, there is this thing called the gender spectrum I've heard about from Sue Bolam on this website, on this blog. And I began to explain to her how the gender spectrum works, which is just that there are 2 different spectrums. There's one for masculinity and one for femininity. And that when God made genders in the beginning, as the word reveals in Genesis 1, that he made man and he made woman. And they're 2 very distinct things. And so it's not as if humanity is one spectrum of sexuality, which is often, I think, probably the more common cultural conception. You've got male on one end of the spectrum and female on another end. The thing that Sue Bolam interacts with is just that those are two different spectrums. And so I just offered that. I said, hey, I think you've got boys who are on 2 ends of one masculinity spectrum. One is rough and tumble, and one is sensitive. One loves trucks, and one loves sports and balls and frogs and dirt and mud and swords and loves to fight, loves all those things that we consider probably traditional or typical masculinity, what Sue Bolam calls rough and tumble. And then there are others who are sensitive, who are quiet, they're introspective, they're typically artistic, they connect better with eye contact. These are the people that turn into artists and actors and creators, and it's wonderful and it's good the way God's designed the way he made it. But they're very different spectrums. And there's also one for femininity too. But I just explained that to this neighbor of mine at the playground. Did it in a couple of minutes, and her reaction was just amazing. That's amazing. I never thought of it that way. That's so wonderful. And so that was a real pleasure to get to share that with her and allow her to think through how to parent her children in a way that's more biblical.
I think you just created a real product interest on the part of a few people to actually get a copy of that, because they have probably been thinking about it. Just before we take a break, let me mention real quickly that one of the others is the Ancient Evidence for Jesus from Non-Christian Sources. That comes from Dr. Michael Gleghorn, has his doctorate and has been on Probe staff, but now is actually out there at Grand Canyon University teaching online. But this one is very helpful, and I'll just mention it real quickly so that we'll have time for some of the others after the break. And that is, are there non-biblical sources for the life and ministry of Jesus? And the answer is yes. Now, as Christians, we believe that we learn more about Jesus from the Bible than anything else. But when you're talking to your skeptical friends, and just the other day we were talking with Natasha Crane about one of the chapters in her book on how to talk to your kids about Jesus was Jesus a myth? Now, even atheists say, no, he's not a myth. Even people that are liberal Christians say, no, he's not a myth. But you'll run into that on Facebook and Twitter and in all sorts of conversations. So there are 2 whole sections that you've done, part 1 and part 2, with Dr. Michael Gleghorn, just answering that question. And again, if you ever run into it, it's just nice to know there's a podcast that takes you through that in a very organized way.
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff. That's actually one of our best, I shouldn't say best sellers, our most retrieved searches from our website is an article by that same name with similar content. And people are just hungry for it. People are asking that question. Is there any evidence outside the Bible? Yeah, there's a ton. There's a ton. We had to fill 2 episodes with it.
Yeah, so again, that one's available as well. We're going to take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about 2 more real quickly. Tactics for any ambassador for Christ. That comes from Greg Kokel's been on the program with us before. And then one on climate change. Dr. Ray Boland's been on there as well. And then I'll also let you give us a short list of some of the ones, preview of coming attractions, I guess we could call that. And if you find yourself saying, okay, I'd like to listen to a few of these podcasts, you don't necessarily have to be on these platforms of Apple or Google or Amazon Music. You can, and that's the way you can subscribe, but you can also simply go to probe.org, and there's a place where you can download it and listen to it on your computer, on your smartphone, or anything else. We'll come back and talk about evangelism, apologetics, and climate change, the whole diversity of what we talk about on Head and Heart, right after this.
Now, back to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Paul Rutherford in studio with us today with Probe Ministries and also the host of the Head and Heart podcast. And we've talked about a couple of the various episodes, but I thought we should at least focus a little time and attention on another one, Tactics for Any Ambassador for Christ. Now, that involves Greg Koukl. He's been on the program with us a number of times. And there, of course, was the 10th anniversary edition of the book Tactics. And frankly, I would have to say, Paul, if you're going to be doing evangelism and you're going to encounter question that you might get from other individuals, he really kind of takes you through sort of the Columbo tactics and how to ask good questions. And I know that book has been very significant even in your own life and experience.
Absolutely. I credit one of the key moments in my life that the Lord used to call me into ministry, and in apologetics in particular, was at an apologetics conference years ago, and Greg Koukl was giving his Columbo talk, and I just remember just being floored. This is so practical, and this is so powerful. And it was inspiring, and that was a watershed moment in my life that the Lord used to turn me and call me into the ministry. So yeah, I love that book. Love their ministry. Personal endorsement all the way out for Stand to Reason and just what they do. And of course, there's so much synergy is the buzzword, but there's so much harmony between what they're doing and the vision of their organization to equip ambassadors for Christ. And that's half of Probe's mission statement, not only to free believers from cultural captivity, but also to build up ambassadors for Jesus. And so there's a lot of harmony there. But yeah, that book is so great, and it's wonderful how it gives you a roadmap for conversation, which often is the difficult part, right? You engage in a conversation,
yes.
You trust the Lord by faith.
You don't know what to say.
You're courageous. You're like, I got to engage with this person, and then you get there and it's like, what do I say? Yeah. One of the great insights from his book, from Greg Koukl and their whole ministry, is asking questions, just learning the art of asking good questions, productive questions, healthy questions that drive the conversation. And yeah, the Columbo tactic is part of it, among other strategies and tactics mentioned in the book.
It's amazing how many people remember that. And for those of you that are younger, you might say, Columbo, that doesn't make any sense. Old
who's
guys,
Columbo?
Remember Columbo saying, now let me ask you a question. Now let me ask you a question. And he does that kind of routine. But nevertheless, that's all the more reason
Peter Falk's performance,
why you just really need to maybe get to episode number 5 on that. But I'm going to keep the train moving because I want you to give us a preview of coming attractions, because number 6 is by Dr. Ray Boland's been on the program with us before on climate change. And really what he tries to do is discuss some of the issues, how to think about this issue of climate change, really to maybe have wise discernment about how it's communicated and whether or not humans are causing it, whether or not the ocean levels are rising. And what about those polar bears and all the rest? So it's really kind of fun. And before we go any further, let me just mention that before we finish today, we will be talking with Dennis Prager. And one of the things Dennis Prager says is you don't even have to know much about science to deal with this issue of climate change or a variety of other things. Don't look at what people say. Look at what people do. And the example he uses, apart from climate change, is, you have some liberals saying that it's a rape culture on college campuses. And yet you see those same individuals making that statement, sending their daughters to that university, which tells me they don't really believe that. Another example, when we talk about the ocean levels, you've had all sorts of people saying, well, the oceans are rising and they're going to flood these low-level areas. And then you see the former president of the United States, Barack Obama, spend $12 million for a house on the ocean in Martha's Vineyard, and you see some of these other individuals that are living right on the seashore. And so if they really thought the oceans are going to be rising, they would be convinced that they would not want to buy this land because it would be underwater. So there's a sense in which Dr. Boland takes you through some of the science, but he also does just a good job of having you, if you will, think about this with a level of discernment, right?
Yeah, indeed. This is our newest episode, the one we just released just this week. It's hot off the press, as we used to say in the printing business. And it's really good. It's a great, I titled it an introduction. Maybe that's a poor title. It's accurate. But Dr. Boland goes through a number of issues related to climate change, and some of the alarmism is a little bit that we get into. We don't do enough. We probably should record another episode on that one. There's a lot to say there, but that what you're talking about there, Kerby, is indeed one of the questions I posed to Dr. Boland. Should I buy a home in Colorado? are the oceans on the rise because they're going to get all the way to me here in Texas, 1,000 feet above sea level. And so we talk about that, and he walks us through some of the data, but walking back all the way to the 19th century. We've been measuring ocean levels and have for a long time. We have data on this kind of stuff. We talk about actual global warming back before it was climate change, when that's what it was called. It's changed names, I guess, more than once. But have global temperatures in fact risen? And we talk about that. What does the data show? It's one thing to say there are models for it. It's one thing to say there's severe weather. That's clearly evidence for it. And we have wildfires, which we're experiencing right now in America, which is horrible. But do these things that we connect with in a really visceral way, do those in fact, are they consistent with these models of the whole climate of the earth changing, or the global temperatures rising? We ask those questions, we talk through it. He cites data, and we talk through that. And yes, those poor, precious polar bears, they are so cute. We do talk about precious polar bears. So there's a little bit of cute factor, too.
As a matter of fact, they are increasing. But let's get to the preview of coming attractions, because these are the first 6. And, of course, within a few weeks, people are going to see some more episodes. Give us a preview of a few things that are coming on the horizon.
Absolutely. We have several that are planning to come out soon, and we do plan to keep releasing them. Right now, about monthly is the plan to keep doing that. So keep coming back, keep checking. Do subscribe on whatever platform you're using for consuming podcasts if you do that. But something I'm excited about is maybe a little bit farther down the road, but we're in talks with Dr. Justin Bass, who is professor at the Jordan Evangelical Theological Seminary, and talking with him about his book, Bedrock, The Bedrock of Christianity, and examining what do the majority of biblical scholars agree is the most authentic, or not the least objectionable, authentic part of Scripture. Mm-hmm. What does it say, and what can we learn about that, according to biblical scholars, we all agree this is genuine. This is the real artifact. And it's interesting because it's mostly a testament to the resurrection. That Jesus was God, that he's resurrected and was crucified, dead, and buried. And it's fascinating. The theological implications are interesting. So looking forward to having him on the podcast here sometime soon. Look for that, hopefully, Lord willing. We've interviewed Steve Cable about some of his cultural research into what is going on with the trends among millennials and Gen Z, what is going on in the church. He, among the people that I do read, has a really good bead on what American evangelicals really do believe and how they behave and how those two correlate. And so we've had some really interesting conversations, especially with the rise of the nuns, how there's just so many people who on surveys are indicating their religious belief is, no, I have no religious belief. And those people are the fastest growing religious demographic in America. So what's up with that? So I had a really great conversation with Steve Cable about that. That was really interesting. So yes, talking about surveys with Steve Cable, biblical scholarship with Justin Bass, Lord willing.
I think we have one on fake news and some of that, and some of the discernment and needs like that, and all sorts of other topics. So just about out of time. So let me just mention, first of all, as people go to a place where they normally get podcasts, so I'm talking to those of you that have some technological expertise, you can go to Apple, Google, Amazon Music, Stitcher. Those are all places where you just type in Head and Heart, or sometimes I think even Probe Ministries will get you there. For those of you, though, that I'm talking to that say, I really don't do podcasts, but I'd like to hear some of these and have them just on my computer or my phone, you can simply go to, again, probe.org, and you'll see a little button that says Head and Heart, or you can go to our website, pointofview.net, and you will find under the picture there of Paul Rutherford a link, and then you can just download it and listen to it as well. So, Paul, first time in studio, and I'm sure we'll do it again, but thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thanks for having me, Kerby. It was a blast.
We are going to take a break, and when we come back, Louisville is front and center. There has been chaos. You've had over 100 people arrested, 2 police officers shot. What about that? And then what about the reasons why the rioting was taking place? We'll get into all of that right after these important messages.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is a Thursday edition of Point of View, and if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. This first hour we're going to have kind of as an open line for a couple of very good reasons, and that is, of course, the chaos that has unfolded in Louisville, Kentucky last night. There are those who were preparing for some announcement and getting ready for a protest and riot, no matter what came down, but of course the decision that came down was not in accord with the desires of many people who were engaged in this. And so far, we've had more than 100 people that have been arrested, 2 police officers shot, and we'll get into all the aspects of that. And once again, try to at least put some of the facts on the table about this incredible tragedy of the shooting of Breonna Taylor. And so we'll talk about that and then maybe move on to some other issues. One of the articles I've posted for you to think about in terms of the broader context is by Heather McDonald. She's been on the program with us before, and this piece is entitled Blue Truth Matters, because, again, there are just all sorts of different things being said that aren't true. Everybody's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts, and we do want to put some of those facts on the table. Then I want to move on, because, after all, one of the things that this event in Louisville and really in some of the other riots around the country have actually moved off of the front page was the fact that we, of course, have the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. That, of course, creates a hole in the Supreme Court. Should Republicans actually confirm her, because the president has said on Saturday he will indeed confirm, I should say, the nominee. We don't know who that is, although we suspect we might know that. So once the president puts forward a nominee on Saturday, should the Senate actually do so? Should Republicans vote for it or not? So we'll get into those issues as well. And then we'll get back to issues of the election, because there are some new facts that are coming down that are really concerning about what this might mean in terms of the accuracy of the counting of various ballots. So we'll get into all of that in the first hour. Next hour, Ilya Shapiro will be with us. We'll be talking about his book, Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations and the Politics of America's Highest Court. I know he wrote that book before he knew for a fact that Ruth Bader Ginsburg would pass on, but nevertheless, his book is so relevant to the conversation we will be having in this next hour. And then before the program is over, we're going to have our good friend Dennis Prager on the program. We'll be talking about the film No Safe Spaces, but also I thought we might talk about a few of the commentaries he's put out recently, which I tend to quote from time to time or post. And so that gives you pretty much of an overview of what's going to happen over the next 2 hours. I hope you can be with us during that entire time. Okay, let's go to Louisville, Kentucky. What you have right now are more than 100 arrests that have taken place, 2 officers that are shot. The city really began to prepare for the possibility of violence as early as Monday. And isn't that a sad commentary? We have, of course, seen all the way back to the Rodney King verdicts and some of that, and all the way through some of these other actions where there has been almost an assumption that any time there is a decision that is rendered, a shooting that takes place, that becomes a justification for all sorts of protests, which almost always turn into riots. And so by Wednesday, hundreds of demonstrators converged on the city city waiting for the announcement. And if you've not seen some of the videos, you recognize that people have prepared for this and even paid for this. One of the videos that is making the rounds through the internet, which no doubt you may have seen, shows this U-Haul truck pulling up and individuals immediately grabbing all sorts of pre-planted signs and all sorts of things and getting started in terms of the protest. Then on some of the articles that you can find, we start seeing all sorts of Twitter posts, fires being started up and down 6th Street in the downtown city. One particular case where then the police decided to actually release videos of some of the protesters causing damage to a business. Police intervened. In this particular case, 13 were arrested. The curfew for 9 p.m. was actually done, and that's where you had then a number of unlawful fires being set by the rioters. Then you have authorities saying one suspect had been arrested in the shooting of the two officers, not identified at that particular time. One in surgery at that time, another is stable. And then a request from the FBI and from the Louisville Police Department seeking the public's help in regarding the shooting of these officers. Anyone with pictures or videos of the incident is asked to provide these files, and they provide a link there as well. So in the midst of that, how did the two individuals who will be debating next week respond? Well, again, I thought I would just read the Twitter post and let you come to your conclusion. President Donald J. Trump had this to post: praying for the two police officers that were shot tonight in Louisville, Kentucky. The federal government stands behind you and is ready to help. Spoke to Governor Andy Beshear, and we are prepared to work together immediately on request. So again, the president talking about those two officers wanting to work with the governor and a couple of other things. Former Vice President Joe Biden's tweet was this: we must continue to speak Breonna Taylor's name, support her family still in grieving, and still give up on ensuring the full promise of America for every American, which, again, is valuable, but tended to completely ignore all the things happening in the streets. And it is, I think, a very logical question for Chris Wallace to ask next week during the presidential debates, and that is, Mr. Biden, we can recognize that obviously you don't want to say anything that might inflame some of those people that are protesting. And I recognize that you believe that the protests are for legitimate reasons. But can you explain why on almost every particular occasion, when there was an opportunity for you to tell people to stand down, to not engage in violence? After all, even the governor of Kentucky, Andy Beshear, put out something. It was said, please go home tonight. There are many times over the coming days when there will be an opportunity to be heard, and so many people are listening, but, don't engage in violence. And yet you don't have Joe Biden making that statement. The crass argument that some people make is, well, some of those individuals out there protesting or even engaged in riots are people that the vice president is dependent upon for his votes. But nevertheless, that is how the response came last night. You can go check all the other Twitter responses. But when we come back from the break, I want to get into one more attempt to at least set the record straight, because there still are a number of individuals that are engaging in misstatements about the shooting. And it's a tragic shooting of Breonna Taylor. And back in August, I read through the 7 myths and misconceptions about the Breonna Taylor case. So I thought I'd go through those again. And there's a very good couple of pieces that have come out from Matt Walsh, who's been on this program with us before, in which, again, he's making the case that we're just not hearing the full story. So we'll talk about that, the justification for the protests and riots, right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a previous set of commentaries, I talked about the interview that we did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Then I saw an essay that quoted his earlier book, The Righteous Mind, where he talked about the conservative advantage. As a liberal, he wrote the book because he was convinced that American liberals did not get the morals and motives of their conservative countrymen. In one study he did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick, they tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. They had people fill out their Moral Foundations questionnaire. 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questions normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. The design of the research allowed the researchers to examine the stereotypes that each side had about the other. This also allowed them to see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and people who were conservative. They concluded that the results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. I might add that this study was published 10 years ago. I think that it's even more likely that the gap in perception by liberals of conservatives has grown even more. Much of what Jonathan Haidt has written about in his recent books illustrates how millennial college students want even more protection from ideas they don't like. They're less likely than before to engage foreign ideas. And this is one example of why we have such polarization in the political arena. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Lend me, if I can, just while we have some time, to talk about at least the facts that we know. And I, back in August, read from a very good piece done by Jeffrey K. Wood, 7 Myths and Misconceptions about the Breonna Taylor case. It turns out that yesterday, when we had the Attorney General of Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, everything that he said correlated with what we said back in August. Now, I'll be fully aware of the fact that some people say, I don't care, or I don't believe you, or because you're not African American, then I won't even listen to the facts you're going to put on the table. Got that. Well, first of all, let me just mention that for those of you that live outside of Kentucky, the Attorney General in Kentucky, Daniel Cameron, is African American, and people say, well, then he just is a shill. And of course, I saw what some of the various liberal outlets said about him, but we'll leave that on the table for the future conversation. But for those of you that at least for a few minutes would like to know, what are the real facts and how has this gotten so messed up? And part of it is that from the very beginning on a couple of these tragic shootings, and this one perhaps the most tragic of all, because of the fact that this is an individual that is wanting to be the first responder, really was completely innocent, does not have a rap record, is a female. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why a lot of people have had an emotional affinity with Breonna Taylor. Got that. But it so happens that a fair amount of this misinformation has come from the attorney, Benjamin Crump, who represents the family in the first place. Let me just read one of his tweets. This comes from May. Louisville police fatally shot Breonna Taylor. They had the wrong address, and their real suspect was already in custody. 2 months later, no one has been held accountable for her death, but we will change that. And those are a good example of a few of the myths and misconceptions that have been promoted time and time again. And so it's not surprising that you've had people say somebody should be held liable for murder. First of all, as I've seen some of the interviews being done, even over the last 24 hours, could you define murder? I mean, murder for most of us is I went into this apartment deliberately to kill her, or I knew she was there and I planned on shooting her. And I think anybody that knows any part of the story knows that's not the case. But let's take the 7 myths real quickly, because again, I know some of you are going to say, I don't care. I got that. But those of you that are at least curious, myth number 1, the police officers raided Breonna home, but that was the wrong address. There is nothing to that story whatsoever. You can actually go and look at the warrant and understand that is indeed the house that they were planning to get to, because there's a very good reason. That is, the former boyfriend, when he was in the jailhouse, actually said that the cash was in her hands, and so they were looking there for evidence. So that's, first of all, it was not the wrong address. Myth number 2, it wasn't necessary for law enforcement to raid Taylor's apartment because the main suspect was already in custody. Well, that's one of those things that's true but very misleading, because after all, Glover, who was actually captured around midnight, the warrant was executed about 40 minutes later, but the purpose of the warrant was not to look for him. The purpose of the raid, according to the warrant, you can read it for yourself, was to find evidence, and that evidence was, of course, for the cash I was talking about just a minute ago. Myth number 3, police raided Taylor's apartment without knocking. That was something that was so routinely reported that it even caused the senator from Kentucky, Rand Paul, to then name his particular piece of legislation Justice for Breonna Taylor, because it's a piece of legislation that would prohibit no-knock warrants by the federal government. By the way, if you've ever listened to this program, especially when we have people like John Whitehead on, we've talked about these no-knock warrants. But nevertheless, they did knock, and the evidence is very clear that that is the case. As a matter of fact, I found a couple of other individuals, because one of the arguments being made right now is only one person heard them knocking. This document looks like there's more than one that actually announced that it was a knock. And, of course, you also have the testimony of the police officers, unless you believe that they are completely illegally stating something that is not the case. So it was originally assumed to be a no-knock warrant, and yet you, of course, have yesterday the Kentucky Attorney General Daniel Cameron and actually saying that they did knock and it was not a no-knock warrant. That was something that was new to me when I announced it back in August. Myth number 4, police say Breonna was shot while she was in bed. That's a story that's been going on for some time. But Walker, who is the one that actually shot at the police, actually said that both he and Breonna Taylor were walking down the hallway of the apartment towards the front door when the police came in. And so that forced entry took place because as they broke in, then he raises up his gun and fires at the police. By the way, that's not in dispute either. All sides acknowledge that the first shot actually came from the individual who was with Breonna Taylor. Then myth number 5, the officer who was then hit by his firearm was supposedly hit by friendly fire. Again, you can look at the evidence there. For example, you can see who was shot, when they were shot, and all of the rest. And so you can set that one aside as well, because he was actually shot by an individual who at the time did not know it was the police. And by the way, on both sides, I can really understand that. Imagine if you're in your home and somebody's pounding on your door and you decide not to open it and you're not even sure you heard them say police, but you're just not sure who it is. They break down the door and you have a handgun in your hand. What are you going to do? You're going to shoot at them because you don't know they're police. And you can understand why the police shot, because they're being shot at as well. I mean, this is a tragedy from the moment it unfolded. But nevertheless, let me take the last two myths. Myth number 6: police shot Breonna 8 times. Well, it turns out actually she was shot 5 times, but I'll leave that one because it's kind of less significant. And then one other claim that Breonna worked as an EMT at the time. Actually, she was. People say that was partially true because she joined as a recruit. And so I would say that 5 of the 7 myths that I read back in August are relevant. The other 2 are kind of incidental, but nevertheless just illustrates how many of the facts were incorrect. But before we take a break, let me quote from Matt Walsh. Matt Walsh, in his most recent commentary, said, everything you're hearing about Breonna Taylor is a lie. It was not a no-knock warrant. I think we showed that. They did announce the boyfriend fired first. Okay, I think we've already acknowledged that. And Breonna was apparently involved in her ex-boyfriend's drug enterprise. All of this has been publicly available for weeks. Then he goes on in another tweet to say the ex-boyfriend said in a jailhouse phone call that Taylor was handling his cash and had thousands of dollars of drug money in her apartment. Whether that was true or not, that was the evidence that was used for the search warrant. And then finally, he takes us through one other piece. He says, let's walk through the steps. Officers obtained a legal warrant. Officers act on said warrant. Officers announce themselves. Officers enter a residence. Officers return fire upon being fired upon. And Matt Walsh says, where in the series of evidence does a crime occur, much less a racist execution or a murder? So again, for people that are willing to look at some of the facts, and these are matter of public record, you might again say, well, the police department just trying to cover their rear ends. Well, that's why you have an investigation, and that investigation was announced yesterday. I mean, you can only go so far, but if you're really looking at the facts, those are the facts that we have. And if nothing else, it just, I think, illustrates again that once you start down the road of having myths and myth information, once you're convinced that indeed you're not safe as an African American in your home, out there jogging, then all these particular incidents and all of the protests just reinforce some of those ideas. And so if cooler heads would prevail, I think we might be able to get some of those facts and figures, but I recognize that's not the world that we find ourselves in right now. If you'd like to join the conversation, that's 1-800-351-1212. And most importantly, I want to come back and spend a little bit of time looking at a few of the articles we've posted, because Heather McDonald has probably done more research on this, and we'll take it out of Kentucky and go back to New York City where she lives and help you understand at least some of the facts and figures associated with what police have or have not done in New York City, in Chicago, and a number of other places. And that article, of course, is available to you on our website, pointofview.net. Then we'll get back into the future nominee for the Supreme Court. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
If you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just a minute, we're going to move on to the fact that we have an opening on the Supreme Court, and that, in some respects, as one of the articles I've posted by John Cass, who's a writer for the Chicago Trib, has really put the issue of law and order and the Constitution back on the ballot. Not that it wasn't there before, but it really is now. But just before we finish off on this whole issue of whether or not police are engaged in bias, and obviously we recognize they're bad cops, always have been in every profession, and in some respects people say if you have a bad businessman, it doesn't hurt a lot of people. A bad cop can hurt a lot of people. So I'm not taking this lightly, but I think one of the pieces by Heather McDonald, which I put on the website for you to read, is a short summary of some of the material that she's posted before. Let's not look at Louisville, Kentucky. Let's not look at Kenosha, Wisconsin. Let's not look at Minneapolis, Minnesota, or Seattle. Let's look at New York City. This is where she lives. And she says, oftentimes when you see any kind of racial disparity, people immediately jump to the idea that that is racial bias. And I did a commentary earlier this week, which you can read on the whole issue. Will a racial disparity always mean racial bias? And she points out, let's look at New York City as a good example. A little over 50% of all the pedestrian stops conducted by the New York Police Department have an African-American subject, a black subject. But blacks are slightly less than a quarter of the city's population. So she says it's easy to jump to the argument that this is proof of racism because, after all, we see that even though African Americans are 25%, make up about 25%, they're actually engaged in 50% of all the pedestrian stops. But she says the problem with a lot of the numbers that have been used, and this is where she's caused me to rethink this, is they use the wrong benchmark. They look at the census data instead of looking at crime rates. And because policing is data-driven, deploying officers to where criminals prey on their victims is what takes place. So now, if you, instead of compare the percentage of people in the country or in the city or in that community, you instead look at the crime statistics, everything clears up pretty quickly. Here's her numbers. Blacks in New York City commit over 70% of all the drive-by shootings, according to victims of and witnesses to these shootings, who are overwhelmingly minorities themselves. She says now if you add Hispanic shootings to black shootings, you account for nearly 100% of the shootings in New York City. Here's what that means. She says these numbers then mean that virtually every time an officer gets a shots fired call over his radio, he is being called to a minority neighborhood on behalf of a minority victim and being given the description of a minority suspect. And if anyone is cooperating with the police for once, the cops don't wish this reality into being. They're forced into it by the facts of the crime. I gave you an example earlier in the week about the number of 911 calls that come from African Americans as well. She gives another example. She talks about Chicago. Blacks commit about 80% of all the shootings and murders, and whites less than 2%, although blacks and whites are each a little less than a third of the population. She has one from St. Louis. Again, blacks commit almost 100% of the homicides there, although they're only 50% of the population. The point she's making is when you compare the number of police stops, the number of arrests or incarcerations, whatever it is, to the population, you're not looking at the best numerator and denominator match. If indeed you want to look at the right denominator, that is the number of crimes that normally take place in that community. One other point that I'll make, and then we're going to move on. The biggest predictor of officer behavior, according to, again, these statistics, is civilian behavior. That is, if a civilian resists arrest, an officer will then be actually forced to increase his or her use of force until he or she gains compliance. If a civilian threatens an officer or bystanders with potentially lethal force, an officer then is legally justified in using lethal force in return. And again, you can look at those statistics, which she has collected over these years, because they're a matter, in many cases, of public record. Blacks resist arrest in 4 times the rate of whites, according to one study. And a decade's worth of data shows that black males make up 40% of all the cop killers, while they're only 6% of the national population. Well, you can go into more detail, but the point she's making is that oftentimes when you see these comparisons, the comparison is made based on, if you will, census data, and it should be a comparison on the basis of crime rates. And the reality is that even though the Justice Department keeps these records, even though many states and cities keep theirs records, there is still a problem in that oftentimes most police departments, as she points out, make it difficult, if not impossible, to get racial data on some of the criminals. So that's, of course, one of the things that hampers even the best research that is being done on that particular topic. Anyway, that's more than enough probably today, but if you find yourself saying, okay, I've got to read it myself. Heather McDonald, very bright individual. War Against Cops is her most recent book. Manhattan Institute, individual that has been on a number of the Prager U videos, which I might mention since we're going to have Dennis Prager on today in the next hour. So you can read those for yourself, and it is the first article we've posted on the website. Let's change topics if we can. And that is John Cass. I've quoted him from time to time, a columnist, says the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg actually has put the issue of the rule of law and the Constitution back on the November ballot. He says the death of the liberal icon Ruth Bader Ginsburg, greatly admired even by her opponents, has wildly transformed the presidential campaign. At one time, the campaign was about Democrat Joe Biden and Republican President Donald Trump, but now the rule of law, he says, is on the ballot, and the Constitution is on the ballot. And, of course, then he goes through, of course, the confirmation hearings that we've had in the past. Justice Brett Kavanaugh, we'll be talking about that with Ilya Shapiro a little bit later, and what to maybe expect if indeed we have a nominee set forth on Saturday, and then being considered by the Senate Judiciary within the next couple of weeks. And, of course, that puts a couple of other issues on the table as well, because the threat has been that if indeed the Republicans who control the Senate do indeed confirm her, then the threats coming from the Democrats are, as he talks about in this column, packing the Supreme Court, ending the Senate filibuster, adding 2 new states, Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. And, of course, some of those threats have been there even before. In some respects, the threat was there even before there was the possibility of a confirmation of a Supreme Court nominee. Then he goes on to point out that with mail-in balloting being offered by some states, that could be overwhelming the process, and with Democrats like Hillary Clinton urging Joe Biden never to concede, the chaos that we experienced back in 2000 with the hanging chads in Florida might, as he said, seem like Sunday or Saturday in the park. And then points out that the retaliation could be pretty significant because, after all, Senate Minority Leader Charles Schumer, New York, a Democrat, has said nothing is off the table. And the Supreme Court nomination hearings will bring, as he said, the tensions among Democrats between the left and the old moderates who remain into sharp focus for the voters. And should Trump nominate a federal appeals judge, Amy Coney Barrett, who's kind of the odds-on favorite at the moment, Democrats would be compelled to attack her Roman Catholic faith, which they've already been doing, by the way, even before she's been nominated, which is exactly what they did during her last confirmation hearings. But something very different that I haven't mentioned until now. There is a member of the Senate Judiciary, and her name is Senator Kamala Harris. Now, you can remember from last time, if your memory goes back 2 years, to the fact that she probably was merciless in her attacks on Brett Kavanaugh. And in order to hold the party's left wing, there is no doubt on the part, at least of John Cass, that Senator Harris will be expected to be in full attack mode at the time in order to really appease those individuals, at the very same time when former Vice President Joe Biden is trying to appeal to Catholic suburban swing state voters. So that's going to be a difficulty and one to be watching as well. He then goes on to point out that this quote from Ruth Bader Ginsburg is not the quote that should be used. There was a quote where Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, "There's nothing in the Constitution that says the president stops being president in the last year." But the quote that everybody wants us to know is the argument from Nina Totenberg of NPR, supposedly told to her granddaughter, "It's my most fervent wish that I would not be replaced until a new president is installed." All that guarantees it's going to be politics day in and day out till November 3rd. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention that in the next hour, we're going to be talking, first of all, with Ilya Shapiro and then with Dennis Prager. And I'm looking forward to both of those interviews. And let's, if we can, also, just before we end this hour, since we did talk about Breonna Taylor, that one of the things that I certainly appreciate that the president, Donald Trump, said, praying for the two police officers while they were shot. I would just add that we should not only pray for those two police officers and all the other individuals in law enforcement, but also for Breonna Taylor's family and for even the attorney who I think has spread some misinformation, but they all are worthy of our prayers, and I would encourage you to do that. But before we wind down this hour, because I won't have much time next hour to talk about this, we once again wonder about what's going to happen in this presidential election. a very good piece that came down in which they have now basically estimated that there are about 350,000 dead registered voters in 42 different states, including a couple of these key swing states. And so as you start looking at those numbers, you begin to realize that there are real questions about whether or not there could be some kind of information that is inaccurate. There could be the possibility for fraud. And even though up until recently I've been trying to point out that even if you assume no fraud, and I believe in human sinfulness and human depravity. But okay, even if you want to set that aside, just all the other issues that are going to surface because of this are going to be very concerning, because 350,000 individuals who are no longer living, who are still on the voter rolls, and about half of them are just in 5 states, including such swing states as Florida and Michigan. It also adds Texas. I don't see Texas as a swing state, but a lot of people do. So, okay, if you think that's a swing state, then you can begin to see that those account for about half of those, and that's a source of some concern. And it brings us back to something else. Last week at this time, I had a commentary called Discarded Ballots. And in that particular case, we point out that if you just look at the primary season we've been through, primarily the Democratic primaries, because there were probably less contested ballots on the Republican primary, you end up primarily, mostly from Democrats, but not exclusively, 558,000 absentee ballots that were tossed out. You might say, why? Well, it's not because Republicans were tossing out Democrat ballots. These were Democrats throwing out Democrat ballots, or individuals that really had no bias one way or the other because they're just election officials. And that was because they arrived after that election day, or because the signatures did not match, or because they voted for more than one individual in a race. There were all sorts of reasons why those ballots were invalidated. And again, let's look at some of those swing states. In Wisconsin, for example, 23,000 ballots were discarded. But in 2016, Donald Trump, Wisconsin, won Wisconsin by 22,000 votes. Can you see how this could get to be a problem very, very significantly? There is another commentary I have coming out next week that you might want to listen to as well, and that is the issue of missing ballots. I mentioned that the other day, but it's worth mentioning once again, and that is that you have, of course, the situation that unfolded in Paterson, New Jersey, in which they basically had to reject 24, almost 25% of the ballots because of one reason or another. The election results were so messed up, they had to take a mulligan, if you will, mulligan from golf, and they will have to redo the election on November 3rd. But what came more recently is even more concerning. This one comes from Sussex County in New Jersey. Sorry, I feel like I'm picking on New Jersey, but they've had some problems up there, in which they discovered 1,666 ballots in a bin that was mislabeled. Now, you have to say, how do you misplace 1,600 ballots? Well, you know, in the case of Paterson, New Jersey, you had a judge that said, yes, we do have a problem with the Paterson, New Jersey case. But in the other elections, the ballot rejection rate was only 9.6%. And then you have in Sussex County that they lost 1,666 ballots. And I've begun to start saying, imagine if we treated your vote as if it had a monetary value. Let's just give it a dollar value. How good would you feel about your bank if they said, you know, we have an ATM machine and it only makes a mistake 9.6% of the time? Or your bank misplaced $1,666 of your money. I think you'd be furious. And that, of course, is exactly what we are dealing with, and all the reason more to say, even if there's no fraud, and there will be, we can guarantee it. Matter of fact, in Henderson, New Jersey, there were a couple people indicted because of that and probably will actually have to pay a fine or even serve time in jail. But nevertheless, even without this, just sometimes the mismanagement alone or just the sheer weight of all of these ballots going through the Postal Service should concern all of us. So, again, one more issue that I wanted to put on the table. And when we talk with our friend Dennis Prager, I did want to get into some of the commentaries he has had, but I'd like to also get his comments about the fact that he's been a real opponent of the lockdowns. Of course, since he lives in California, I can imagine. And yet we have this new survey that's just come out, which points out that actually 1% of the counties in the United States have actually had half of all the COVID-19 deaths. This is just an incredible number. And again, it also, I think, illustrates how New York City, in many cases, skews the data even for the rest of the state. I'll hold this up for those of you watching. It shows what happens if you take New York City out of the rest of the state of New York. Or another one that I will hold up for those of you watching, the very large number there is New York City. Then next is Detroit, Chicago, Miami, Phoenix. You can see that if you take New York City out of this, maybe the COVID deaths aren't as bad as we've been led to believe. I'm not sure that Donald Trump will use that as a response to the obvious criticism that he will receive from Joe Biden, but it is important to recognize that 1% of the counties in the United States actually account for nearly half of all the COVID-19 deaths. And so I thought when we get talking with Dennis Prager, we're going to be, of course, talking about his film, No Safe Spaces. I've got a copy of his book, too, which we'll talk about, and I'll mention a few of his commentaries as well, and, of course, encourage you to find out more about PragerU. But if you haven't seen the film or don't have a copy of the book, we'll be talking about that with him. And Ilya Shapiro will be with us, because he really wants to take us through really the incredible history of America's Supreme Court, its early founding, then some of the great tensions that have caused what he calls supreme disorder. And the battle over the Supreme Court is due in large part because of the fact that especially progressives who know that they could not possibly pass legislation through Congress have been depending on the courts to do their work and to do their bidding. And oftentimes Congress has been all too willing to let them handle the controversial issues, abortion, affirmative action, homosexual marriage, whatever it might be. And so as a result, the so-called co-equal branches haven't been so equal, because sometimes a 6-3 or 5-4 decision by the Supreme Court becomes the law of the land. So we'll talk about that with him and maybe get some perspective on these judicial nominations, but we need to take a break. If you'd like to know more about these books or these articles we've mentioned, they're all available at our website, pointofview.net.
Sometimes I think about seeds. You ever stop to consider that some seeds become entire trees and some trees grow up and produce fruit? Other seeds become flowers or vines that bring us vegetables or berries. And some trees don't have fruit, but they're just pretty, especially in some parts of the country when it comes to the fall colors. Yes, sometimes my mind goes off like that. And I also think about such things when it comes to the seeds that so many have planted in the quest to impact our nation through Point of View Radio. You may think that your gift is a small thing, but like a seed, it can grow to have an impact beyond your imagination. If you want to see beauty again in America, consider planting a seed today and making a difference by joining the Point of View Truth Team. Get the details today, right now, by visiting pointofview.net/team or call us at 1-800-347-5151. Plant a seed for a great future. Cultivate truth. pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of view, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
For a few minutes, we want to spend some time talking about an issue that I've written about in terms of constitutional interpretation, something we talk about so often with Kelly Shackelford, who usually joins us on Friday. Of course, Jeremy Dice will be with us tomorrow on our Friday weekend edition. And, of course, we have other lawyers in studio to talk about that. But we're going to get into this whole idea of judicial nominations. It's a new book published by Regnery, 380 pages, 22 chapters, Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics of America's Highest Court. It is written by Ilya Shapiro, who is the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, also publisher of the Cato Supreme Court Review, individual that has, as an author and speaker, also testified before Congress, filed more than 300 friend of the court briefs in the Supreme Court. And so, Ilya, thank you so very much for joining us. I might also mention your law degree is from the University of Chicago. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I'm happy to be on your show.
I love history, so I kind of really dug in on some of the early chapters there. I'd forgotten all the controversy surrounding John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice, actually Chief Justice, and all the way down to the first Catholic to the court, since we're going to be talking about a possible Catholic to the court, Judge Taney. But nevertheless, you take us through a little of that history, and it is very clear, I know this is sort of a softball question, that if you read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton did not expect the court to be the thing that it is today, did not expect that it was going to be deciding all sorts of controversials, ranging from abortion to affirmative action to labor law to environmental laws to gay marriage or everything else. This was something that was vastly changed and maybe illustrates why today there is such controversy surrounding these court nominations.
Yeah, that's a good summary of why we are where we are. We have the confluence of a culmination of several trends. First, the aggregation or concentration of power in the federal government in Washington. Within Washington, the skewing of that power away from the legislative branch, which is supposed to be the one to hash out our policy differences, clash of values, what have you. Instead, it's pushed into the administrative agencies that issue the regulations that dwarf the number of laws that Congress passes. And, of course, you can't unelect the bureaucrats and civil servants. You can only sue them. And so all of these disputes get into the court. And at the same time, we have divergent interpretive theories of how to apply the law and resolve those disputes that have been thrown into the court that map onto partisan preferences at a time when the parties are more ideologically sorted than they've been since at least the Civil War, if not ever. So, of course, given those dynamics, whenever there's an opening for one of these very powerful seats, there's going to be a big battle royale for it.
One of the things that we talked about before you joined today, because I just pointed out that if you thought the Kavanaugh nomination and hearings, which we all vividly remember, were something that were off the charts, you have to recognize that one of the individuals asking some of the toughest questions is now the vice presidential nominee, Senator Kamala Harris. And so, indeed, whether it's Amy Coney Barrett or whoever it might be, you know they're going to be be really pointed questions. There are going to be even more protests, perhaps, outside of the Senate Judiciary hearing rooms. And so in some respects, it's going to be more necessary, as you talk about later in the book, to try to figure out a way to depoliticize the court nomination process. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. It's unclear what strategy the Democrats would take. I mean, they might boycott the hearings altogether. That might be
possible,
a way to go. If they don't, we'll have the unprecedented scenario of the vice presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, who's a senator on the Judiciary Committee, asking questions of the Supreme Court nominee. That's never happened before. And that will be a moment that affects both the direction of this fight over the seat as well as the broader political argument over the election.
So again, one of the things that we might talk about, or later on in your book, you talk about what you call the judicial confirmation machine. And that is sort of the question that people have had about how that takes place. Of course, you even mention, of course, Amy Coney Barrett in terms of the dogma lives loudly within you. But there has been a machine that has been developed to either try to push through a nominee or to prevent a nominee. And I guess since I'm the old guy around the table, I can remember back when I was doing a radio interview when Judge Robert Bork was put forward and people were saying, we need to actually write to the Supreme Court justices. And I said, oh, that doesn't seem appropriate because after all, these sometimes are controversial. Hainsworth, Carswell, a few others. I never saw it coming, but now we have this whole machine guiding the whole nomination and attempt to defeat the nomination that never really existed in any significant way a few decades ago, did it?
Well, there's very little new under the sun as far as the history of the relationship of politics to judicial nominations is concerned. I mean, George Washington, right at the beginning, had a nominee rejected. Probably about half the presidents have had some trouble filling nominees. The historical confirmation rate is about 3/4. What's different now is that the outside interest groups definitely have more money, more attention, more media, that sort of thing. Although
yes, they do.
we had outside group pressures starting in about the 30s with labor unions, the NAACP, and other organizations, and these come from all different directions. The attacks on Bork, what was novel about that is that there was no question that he had the intellect or the background. It was purely a disagreement over his ideas, but not just that. It was trying to twist those ideas and portray him as an evil person or someone far outside the mainstream, really demagoguing this sort of thing. Because I tell you, and I write this in my book, A Supreme Disorder, that if a senator wants to vote against a nominee because he or she thinks that that person will do damage to the Constitution or be against the rule of law or what have you, that's perfectly fine. That's valid. Make your case and,
sure.
and explain. And that's, I encourage that sort of, that's responsible constitutional behavior to the oath that you took as a senator. But kind of demagoguing these things, let alone making personal attacks and smears, that's an escalation. And that's why in the last few decades, we've seen kind of these tit-for-tat ratcheting up of tensions and battles in various ways. That's hit the lower courts as well. After Bork, 4 years later, with Clarence Thomas, and then skirmishes over lower courts began. Filibustering of George W. Bush's nominees in 2003 by Harry Reid, the first ever partisan filibusters of judicial nominees. 10 years later, Harry Reid, now in the majority, got rid of the filibuster for lower court nominees.
That's for sure.
And then a few years, what Mitch McConnell said, you'll rue the day this will come back and bite you. And 4 years later, of course, it did. The Republicans kept the Scalia vacancy open, didn't take up Garland. It's not the first time in our history, by the way, that a nominee hasn't been acted upon. It's happened about 10 or 12 times. And then filled it with Gorsuch and had to remove the filibuster to seat him. And then the Kavanaugh explosion. And now we have a further escalation with this vacancy right before the election. So, I don't know, how do we escape it? We can talk about that, but it's not an easy solution or a silver bullet.
We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
In a previous set of commentaries, I talked about the interview that we did with Jonathan Haidt on his book, The Coddling of the American Mind. Then I saw an essay that quoted his earlier book, The Righteous Mind, where he talked about the conservative advantage. As a liberal, he wrote the book because he was convinced that American liberals did not get the morals and motives of their conservative countrymen. In one study he did with Jesse Graham and Brian Nozick, they tested how well liberals and conservatives could understand each other. They had people fill out their Moral Foundations questionnaire. 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questions normally, answering as themselves. 1/3 of the time they were asked to fill out the questions as they think a typical liberal would respond. And 1/3 of the time they were supposed to fill out the questionnaire the way they believed a typical conservative would respond. The design of the research allowed the researchers to examine the stereotypes that each side had about the other. This also allowed them to see how accurate their answers were compared to people who were liberal and people who were conservative. They concluded that the results were clear and consistent. Moderates and conservatives were most accurate in their predictions, whether they were pretending to be liberals or conservatives. Liberals were the least accurate, especially those who described themselves as very liberal. I might add that this study was published 10 years ago. I think that it's even more likely that the gap in perception by liberals of conservatives has grown even more. Much of what Jonathan Haidt has written about in his recent books illustrates how millennial college students want even more protection from ideas they don't like. They're less likely than before to engage foreign ideas. And this is one example of why we have such polarization in the political arena. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kerby's booklet, A Biblical View on Anti-Semitism, go to viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism. Viewpoints.info/anti-Semitism.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again as we talk about the book Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics of America's Highest Court. Just came out this week, and it is available on your local bookstore, but we also have an opportunity for you to order, if you'd like, in hardcover and Kindle. And again, this is a resource that I think you will find very helpful. Ilya Shapiro with us, and again, the director of the Center for Constitutional Studies at the Cato Institute, and an individual that has put together 22 different chapters. Matter of fact, Chapter 11, The Original Sin of Judge Robert Bork, and then the 12th chapter on insult after injury, and then we talked, of course, about the Thomas travesty, and all the way up to, of course, the most recent ones with Brett Kavanaugh. But I thought for just a minute, if you could help us with the suggestions and solutions being proposed. One of those that you address in Chapter 20 is term limits. Now, I've had some people that have been on this program, some that have legal background, that have suggested that maybe that would be something that would be implemented. Of course, you would need a constitutional amendment, or you'd need a constitutional convention to do so. But as you point out, it's been one of those evergreen reform proposals that come up from time to time. What about it?
Yeah, I mean, this is not a panacea. It wouldn't fix the dynamic I described with power being centralized and the Supreme Court being very important. But at least it would build public confidence, because we know when the vacancies would arise. It would be a regular sort of thing. So an 18-year term with 9 justices, so vacancy every 2 years. Each presidential term has 2 vacancies in non-election years. So you know when you're electing a president or a Senate, it's not theoretical. They are going to be deciding these 2 seats over the next 4 years. That would eliminate this kind of morbid health watch over octogenarian justices or politically timed retirements or these sorts of things. So maybe that would be a healthy thing. I think it would increase public confidence. But again, would not change how the court works, would not even necessarily change the court's ideological balance based on the normal rotation of the parties through the Senate and through the White House. But as you said, it would take a constitutional amendment, and so that's a heavy lift.
I would think so. One of the ones, of course, we're hearing most about is adding more justices. Now, this isn't the first time. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was real concerned that maybe the justices were a little overworked, so maybe we need to have more justices on the Supreme Court. And one of the things I appreciate about your book is you remind us we didn't always used to have 9 Supreme Court justices. There's nothing in the original text of the Constitution. Those were, as I read through there, something I did not realize that we could have had 10. Of course, we at one time had 5, 6, all those kinds of things. But nevertheless, the Democrats right now are talking about packing the court. What about this idea of adding more justices to the Supreme Court?
Well, when FDR tried it in 1937, it didn't work out so well for him. He had just been reelected in a landslide, won all but 2 states. That was the as goes Maine, so goes Vermont election in 1936. But the Supreme Court had been rejecting all of his New Deal programs until then. And so he proposed, as you said, to add 1 justice for every justice that was too old. Over 70 and a half was the cutoff. It would have meant adding 6 justices. Hugely unpopular. His vice president, John Nance Garner, campaigned against it. The Chief Justice and Louis Brandeis, who's a big social progressive reformer, was against it, sent a letter to Congress about it. At the next midterm, even though FDR himself was popular, in 1938, the Democrats lost 80 seats in the House and 8 in the Senate just because of this court packing plan. And historically, even before then, whenever, you mentioned we've gone as low as 5, as high as 10, whenever Congress played around with that number, there were a lot of negative drawbacks, long-term disadvantages of various kinds. Now, we've had during the Democratic primaries, most recently starting last year, most of the candidates who are running were endorsing some kind of court packing, restructuring, expansion, what have you. Notably, 2 candidates that did not are Joe Biden, who obviously is the nominee, although now he's kind of hedging his bets about what he'd do. He'd probably get pressured if that really took on steam. And Bernie Sanders, one of the few things that I think, maybe the only thing on which I agree with Senator Sanders. He was asked, what about this? Well, it's nuts because I'm not going to do the accent, but he said, in a couple of years, the Republicans will take over again. Yep. They'll add some more. And in 50 years, we'll have 87 justices. That's insane. And I agree with that. That would totally blow things out of proportion. And, if the complaint that the Democrats have is that the Republicans are busting norms or otherwise acting inappropriately by rushing to confirm whichever nominee President Trump makes. Well, 2 wrongs don't make a right, and busting more norms generally doesn't cure whatever wrong you see is going on.
Again, you have some other ideas of restructuring the court, but I thought since we're going to be moving very quickly into the confirmation hearings, just a lot of great material in your book, but you have a section here on maybe how to change the confirmation hearings. Give us just a little bit of an idea there. It won't happen anytime soon, but it was an attempt to recognize that in some respects, these hearings have gone far beyond what really, I'm sure, was intended by the founders or even actually was part of the original Senate tradition. So what kind of changes could we make to these confirmation hearings?
Well, first of all, I don't think the founders contemplated hearings in the first place. We didn't have public hearings on Supreme Court nominees until 1916, when Louis Brandeis, who I mentioned, was the first Jewish nominee and was a social crusader, was politically very controversial. Now, at the time, they had the first ever hearing, but it was seen as unseemly for a nominee to appear before the Senate committee in his own right. So he didn't testify. Still, the process took almost 5 months, the longest to this day of any confirmation process. He was ultimately confirmed by a wider margin than some of the more recent controversial nominees, but a very tumultuous year. After Brandeis was confirmed, in fact, Charles Evans Hughes resigned from the court and ran against Woodrow Wilson for the presidency that fall. So you can imagine it was a very, very big political, legal year at the time. The way the hearings have changed, I mean, this really started with Bork. The way that the attacks, the serious smears and questioning. And it wasn't always, since then, we didn't always have such controversy. Ginsburg herself or Stephen Breyer, they did go through 4 days of hearings. It was still grueling and intense, but it wasn't the same sorts of attacks all the time. And then things have escalated as other mechanisms have escalated, as I mentioned, the filibuster of the lower court nominees and what happened with Garland and Gorsuch and all the rest of it. So the hearings really have devolved into gotcha moments and softballs, depending on which side you're on. And I actually say in my book that I think ultimately now the cost to the public discourse of having these public hearings for Supreme Court nominees, at least, is greater than any benefit we get in learning about the nominee or about the law in general. Because in the internet age, you can read all of their academic writings or their judicial opinions or what have you. And so any sensitive ethical things you can discuss in the closed sessions that they have to discuss the FBI background check and the nominee's finances and things like that.
Sure. We talked yesterday on one of my commentaries about Senator Ben Sass, who just says, look, lots of times these hearings are nothing more than just trying to come up with sound bites to send back to the local media to play. But let me just, before I run out of time, mention again, 380 pages. It is a book you probably can find in your local bookstore, but we have a link to it so you can get it both on hardback and paperback, or in Kindle, I should say. And we also have a link to cato.org. The link we have right now actually takes you to the Center for Constitutional Studies. There's a very good video there. It's about 3.5 minutes long, so that tells you a little bit about what they are doing in that particular organization. It is certainly worthy of your financial support if you would like to support the work of the Cato Institute, and most importantly, if you would like to know more about the book or like to really understand what is happening in terms of the controversy surrounding the Supreme Court. This book has just been out this week, and I thought you would like to know about it, and it's a good, if you will, run up to what is going to be, I suspect, a very controversial judicial nomination and confirmation hearing. So, if nothing else, Ilya Shapiro, thank you for writing the book, and thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Thank you. And if you go to supremeorder.com, you can download a statistical and historical appendix of all the different nominations in our history and really do a deep dive if you want to.
Again, that link to Supreme Disorder, you can find that as well. And again, the book is just out, so if you don't find it in your bookstore, it probably will show up in the next day or two. And if not, we've given you an opportunity to order it there as well. Let's take a break, though. When we come back, Dennis Prager is going to be with us. We'll be talking about his film that's been out for many months, No Safe Spaces. And also, I have a copy of his book that matters that. You know, if you like the movie, you love the book. Actually, the book's better than the movie because you got more content in it. But nevertheless, we're going to talk about that with him. And, of course, oftentimes we quote from him, so it'll be fun to just get his reaction to a couple of ideas and issues that we have talked about before in his absence. So we're looking forward to having him with us as well. If you would like to know more about these books, movies, and other resources, it's all available at the website, pointofview.net. We'll be back right after this.
2020. It's been a pretty eventful year. We've experienced international tensions over the coronavirus and lockdowns, economic uncertainties, cities overrun by protests, rioting, and looters, and coming soon, a presidential election. Question: where will you get real news, credible opinion, clear biblical thinking on the things that matter most? Answer: Point of View Radio with Kerby Anderson and the team. You can make sure their voices continue speaking loud and clear by taking a moment right now and joining the Truth Team. It is easy, but you do have to visit our website or make a quick call. Go to pointofview.net/team or call 800-347-5151. You have the power to make a difference. Joining the Truth Team can help ensure that millions of people will get a different opinion from the major purveyors of fake news. We don't get big advertising dollars like the networks or tax money like PBS. We depend on you. Pointofview.net/team and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Final half hour, we're going to have a chance to talk with an individual that we quote from so often, Dennis Prager. Whether we are quoting about whether or not the left has a moral compass or no compass at all, or the whole question of lockdowns, or the whole question of whether or not there's a difference between the left and liberalism, or whether it should even capitalize black. Those are all topics we cover on a pretty regular basis by posting his commentaries and hearing from him as well. We also point you oftentimes to the PragerU videos, now 4 billion views, if you can believe it. And, of course, has been a radio talk show host really since 1982 and founded Prager University back in 2011. But I'm holding in my hands, of course, the book, No Safe Spaces. And if you have not seen the film, you need to, and we'll be talking about that. But I also recommend the book. The book is as good, if not better, than the movie. So, Dennis Prager, always great to have you on the program with us.
Wow. I tell you, I was transfixed by your guest.
Well, nothing else. We do tend to quote from you. It's amazing. I don't necessarily set out to quote your columns and post them, but you're right up there. Matter of fact, I think you're number one. I think maybe Victor Davis Hanson becomes number two and a couple others, but it's just so many times I read your commentary and I say, well, I know I look like a Dennis Prager fanboy, but you're really raising a lot of important issues. But let's do our duty, first of all, to promote No Safe Spaces, because last time we had you in studio, we were talking about that, and now there is an opportunity for people still to watch it or to get a DVD. So tell us more, if you might.
Well, this was sort of prophetic, unfortunately, because the movie is about the suppression of free speech on campuses. And for those who thought, well, maybe this is sort of an exaggeration, I think now everybody understands with what is called the cancel culture.
Yep.
That this is the greatest threat to free speech in American history. This has never existed since 1776.
And you say that in the film. You know, there's sometimes you can't say this is unprecedented, but that's one time, and really it is unprecedented, right?
That's right. It's very rare that something is unprecedented. There was one thing liberals, and I always cite it, as you pointed out, the difference between liberals and left. Liberals and conservatives always agreed that I may not agree with you, but I will fight for your right to say what you believe. That is no longer the case. If you watch what goes on campuses, if you watch what goes on Google and Facebook and Twitter, the president last week, the president of the United States tweeted a doctor, and Simone Gold, and who has had the temerity of saying as a doctor that hydroxychloroquine and zinc works. And the tweet was removed, and the Facebook page was shadow banned. I mean, this is a major medical doctor, and so this notion of follow the science is a lie. It's follow the scientists we agree with. Anyway, the movie foretold what's happening, and I always tell people that it is a great movie, and it's not great because I'm in it. I happen to be in a great movie. What the producers and directors did with this is you will be riveted for the hour and a half, and you may even cry at the end or at least have the chills. People should watch No Safe Spaces. Go to nosafespaces.com, and you can see it.
And we do have a link there. And I might just point out, in case people think, well, it's just going to be just a conservative gathering, because you have Jordan Peterson on there, you have Alan Dershowitz on there, you have Cornel West on there, just to mention just a few off the top of my head that are part of this as well. And that is what is, I think, so striking, Dennis Prager, and that is, for some time, you've been saying that on this program, Kelly Shackelford and myself and all sorts of others have been saying this, and we've been saying big tech is getting too powerful and the university has become crazy. I found that the last time I spoke on campus, people follow me around and not letting me speak and wanting equal time and all the rest. But the bottom line is now individuals who, if you will, are card-carrying liberals like Alan Dershowitz and others that are saying, wait a minute, this is something that is so antithetical to the university setting and now has come out of the university into the society. And when you look at even what happened last night in Louisville, Kentucky, you can see the evidence of what has happened from the university making its way into the streets of America.
Well, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, Dershowitz is a great example of a liberal who's not a leftist. He says to me in the film, in his apartment in New York City, he said, as an American, as a liberal, as a Democrat, as a Jew, I fear the left much more than the right.
Wow.
If you're a liberal, that's the litmus test. If you don't fear the left more than the right, then you are a naive, foolish liberal.
Let's, if we can, maybe pick up on one of your columns that we've been quoting from, and that is you had to admit you were wrong. And I always love it when any of us have to say, I thought this, but I changed my mind. And that is you've always been saying that the left's moral compass is broken. But then you make the argument that in order for you to have a broken moral compass, you need a moral compass to begin with, and the left doesn't have one. And you're not using that, as I understand it, as an attack, but just an observation. And then you give us some examples, which I thought were very helpful, because most of us and most of our listeners are certainly within the Judeo-Christian tradition. We start with an assumption that there is right and wrong, there's good and evil. But we make a mistake of assuming other people think the same way. And in some respects, it connects very well with the movie that you've produced, No Safe Spaces, because a lot of people, especially on the left, don't think in terms of moral categories, do they?
We prove it. It's not even, it's not as you correctly and very perceptively point out, it's not an attack, it's a description. They have substituted three categories for good and evil, which they don't like. Good and evil strikes them as religious terms, and they happen to be right. Outside of the Judeo-Christian tradition, you don't get much of it. The people don't divide the world between good and evil as a rule. They divide it, as the left does, for example, between strong and weak. So America's strong, so it's wrong. Iran is weaker than America, so it's right. Israel is strong, so it's wrong. Palestinians are weak, so they're right. Next division is the racial division. Black is right, white is wrong. I was taught in the 1970s at Columbia University that a black cannot be a racist. That proves they don't think in terms of right and wrong. They think in terms of black and white. A black can't be a racist is as moronic as a black can't be a murderer, or for that matter, a white can't be a murderer. I mean, it's again that's the division. So they make these divisions, and the other one is rich and poor. Rich are wrong, poor are right. And by the way, since the only opposition to this is Judeo-Christian, it's worth noting that in the Bible, and I commend to your listeners most important project of my life, my commentary on the first 5 books of the Bible called the Rational Bible. Mm-hmm. Two volumes are out, and I point out in Exodus, Genesis and Exodus are out. Deuteronomy's coming out next year. And there is a law in Exodus. You cannot favor a poor man in judgment.
Right.
So it completely undermines the left-wing view that of social justice. Social justice, why don't they use the word justice? They use the word social justice because that is not the same thing as justice. Favoring the poor is social justice. favoring justice is justice. And so they don't ask who is right and who is wrong. They ask who is rich, who is poor, who is white, who is black, and who is strong and who is weak.
Let's see if we can take a break, and when we come back, we'll chat for just a few more minutes with Dennis Prager. Let me commend to you, first of all, the Rational Bible. As he said, you have Genesis and Exodus and more coming out that I think would provide you with a great look at the first 5 books, the Torah of the Bible. When we come back, wanted to quote from an individual that, as a Jew celebrating the high holidays, is also arguing that we need to have another coronavirus lockdown, and I suspect that Dennis Prager has some comments about that. So we'll get into those issues and give you a chance to hear a little bit more about Dennis Prager. We also, of course, have a link to No Safe Spaces, and if you've not seen the video or would like to get a copy, we've made it possible there for you to find it at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes with Dennis Prager. Let me just mention one of the links we have there will take you to prageru.com, and you'll notice that one of the pieces there relates very much to something we've posted today by Heather McDonald, Blue Truth Matters, a very good piece by Heather McDonald, but also Candace Owens actually did an interview with her, and you'll find all sorts of other videos 4 billion views, so certainly something to consider. But Dennis Prager, I thought for just a minute, on the Hill, you have an individual by the name of Tara Soenshine who says, as a Jew, I celebrate the high holidays. I think she's, of course, talking about Rosh Hashanah and coming up to Yom Kippur. And she points out that we're doing it on Zoom, but then points out that she is convinced that we need to have another lockdown. Now, I guess you're in California, so you never really got out of your lockdown, but she says, consumers are sick, they can't shop, and there's data to actually show that the closure of public spaces leads to reduction in infections and death, and gives all sorts of justifications for it, but seems to be ignoring something that I've talked about, I know you've talked about. There is a very significant, not just economic cost to these lockdowns, but a social and mental health cost as well. And yet that's the argument she's making for actually pushing for another lockdown. And I suspect we might even hear that from the former Vice President Joe Biden on the debate next week. Your thoughts?
Yeah, he's actually said he would. He'd lock down the country. I wrote in March this was the greatest mistake in history. Not greatest evil. I made the distinction. Evils, there are massive numbers of evils. But as regards a gigantic, almost universal mistake, there's nothing comparable. The only country that didn't do it was right, Sweden. Kids went to school. People don't wear masks now. There's nobody dying in Sweden now. And everybody is leading a normal life, including, as I said, school. Obviously, if you lock down every human being, you won't spread a virus. But then as soon as you let anybody out, the virus will resume. You can't lock down a society forever. Everybody knows that. I mean, what would happen after 3 years? That it would crush the economy. We would end up beyond the Depression. I mean, we would have crushed the country. And all the people who call for lockdowns are getting their salaries. They don't know. They don't give a damn. I really do believe that. I don't think they give a damn. Sorry for the language, but I don't know a better word. They don't care in the least about the people who lost their businesses or lost their jobs. And what we've done is I've argued this for years before this. I actually developed a saying, health über alles. Under Hitler, there was the famous Deutschland über alles, Germany above all. We have now made health above all, health über alles.
Wow.
And so all other concerns, there is no other moral concern. The ability of kids to play with kids. I mean, I know people whose kids have not played with another kid for half a year. That's injurious to children. School schmool, not playing. Playing is much more important to children than sitting in a classroom. And I know people, they're so scared. I mean, we have raised the opposite of the generation. When I grew up, there was a pandemic called the Hong Kong flu, killed 100,000 Americans of all ages, unlike now when virtually, I think over 70, you have 10,000 times more of a chance of dying than under 15. I mean, it's almost silly how isolated it is to people with comorbidities and a very late age. So we have raised a frightened generation. We had Woodstock during the middle of the Hong Kong flu, where 100,000 or whatever they were young people got together, frolicked, and they to say that they didn't have social distancing is an understatement, obviously. The whole point of Woodstock was not to social distance. So it's a different country. It's no longer the land of the free and the home of the brave. We have much less freedom, and we have much more cowardice. Nobody is as cowardly as teachers. The moral decline of the teaching profession is another tragedy in America. Teachers are afraid to show up when the number of teachers killed by students is close to zero. around the world, not just in America, and yet they won't show up. And this is who's teaching your children. The only good thing that might come out of all of this, I can't think of another one, is that people might start homeschooling their children more. The schools are rotten, stupid, and cowardly.
And again, one other aspect of this that we talked about earlier in the program, just 1% of the U.S. counties have nearly half of all the COVID-19 deaths. I mean, you're originally from New York City, and if you look at that graph that was produced by the Heritage Foundation, compare it to Detroit, Chicago, Miami, Phoenix, Los Angeles, whatever, you realize that is the case as well. So not only the demographics, but the geographical distribution as well. But before we go, I certainly wanted to focus, as we did, on no safe spaces, but I thought for just a minute we might focus, as we have a link to PragerU. I've certainly enjoyed the fireside chats, you and Otto, and we've had Michael Knowles on the program in the past, and of course we've mentioned the book club, and of course I just mentioned Candace Owens' show and so much more. So if some of our listeners, and I can't imagine there are too many, have not had a chance to watch some of the videos, as you go there, you'll find out that they're not only just the videos, but these featured series videos and other resources. And this has been just an outstanding success, PragerU, hasn't it?
If somebody would have said to me when we started, like about 8 years ago, somebody who said, you'll have 1 million views a year, I would have said, that's very sweet of you to say that from your mouth to God's ears, but, I live in reality. We're not going to have 1 million views a year. If somebody would have said you'll have 1 billion views a year, I would be sure that they were mocking me.
Yes.
We have 1 billion views a year, now
Amazing.
More than that.
Amazing.
It is amazing, and it's actually a reason, and I'm not a built-in optimist, but it is a reason for hope, because the 65% of the views are people under 35 years of age.
I saw that, yeah.
That's a big deal. So, and the fireside chat, I remember the first one. I sat on my fireside, as you well know. I don't know if in the very beginning Otto was part of it, my now world-famous bulldog. But anyway, I just thought, I will give this a try. I'll just speak from the heart to the people watching. There's no script. There's no preparation. And we'll see where it goes. Well,
There you go.
Again.
Yeah. Well, we're just about out of time here, and you're a talk show host. I got to end on the second. But if nothing else, again, PragerU. And, of course, we have a link to No Safe Spaces. We have information about if you'd like to find out more about the Rational Bible. And if all this was not enough, on a pretty regular basis, we post at least a column or two by Dennis Prager. So it's just been great to have you on the program, and I look forward to the next opportunity.
I'm honored by your reactions. Please know that.
Let's take a break. Tomorrow we will spend some time with our weekend edition. We'll be, of course, talking about who might be proposed by the president to fill the Supreme Court nomination. We'll continue to watch what's happening in Louisville, Kentucky, and a variety of other topics will certainly be on the page. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. We'll see you tomorrow on our weekend edition.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. pointofview.net/signup. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.